Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Free the Truth recorded session with a very courageous and intelligent and capable journalist from Iceland, Bjartmar Alexandersson. Bjartmar, very glad to have you here because you've done some excellent work recently and in the past, particularly in the news now because of the revelations in Stundin in relation to the persecution of Julian Assange and the role of Sigurdur Thordarson in lying to the FBI potentially about and giving testimony, which was then used to further the extradition of Assange. So very glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And I'd like to start firstly because it would be nice for our viewers to know if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background as a journalist, please.
Wow, that's not really long. I've been in journalism for about 3.5 years. Actually came before that, I came from recycling. I owned a recycling company that specialized in electronics for almost 10 years. So I didn't come back any background in journalism. Was a little bit in activism at the time when I was running a company, but that's about it. I started at DV, newspaper in Iceland, and I worked my way through the Icelandic media until I ended up in Stundin in May of last year. And I've been following this story now for over the past almost 6 months.
That's really fascinating to hear that you come from an environmental activism potentially background and moving here. And of course, WikiLeaks has its own environmental revelations in relation to the Trafigura dumps of the Ivory Coast.
Exactly.
Presumably WikiLeaks was somewhere in the horizon of things that you were aware of.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Mr. Thordarson, who he is, and then a little bit more about what he told you. So may I start by asking you to tell us, to give our viewers a sense of who Sigurdur Thordarson is and what his background is, please?
Well, Sigurdur Ingi Thordarson, or actually now Sigurdur Thordarson, since he changed his name, he cut out of his middle name. This is a usual thing done by Icelandic criminals to try to hide in the system. He actually started very young in breaking the law. He has actually been charged and indicted regarding financial fraud, and also 2 convictions of sexual abuse, one against one individual, and another time, the second time, he was sentenced for abusing 9 minors. So he has a fairly colorful background, and he's known here in Iceland as the con artist of Iceland. It's everybody knows who Siggi the Hacker is. Although the name Siggi the Hacker is really strange, because according to my research, he is not a hacker. He has no computer skills at all to hack. In one of his emails to the FBI, which I have, he's asking the FBI for assistance to get a video out of a mobile phone. So his computer skills are quite bad at this time. But he started his career with the so-called milestone documents. And those documents, Milestone was a financial institute that actually owned a lot of companies, including some stock in banks, Icelandic banks, and so on. After the financial collapse, of course, many people wanted to know what was happening behind the doors of these financial institutions, because later we found out that this was all fraud, and we actually sentenced most of the bank managers in jail here in Iceland regarding this. The milestone leak, as he says it is, put him on the map. But the actual truth is that he was actually trying to sell the milestone documents to several media outlets here in Iceland. And finally, he sold it to DV, a newspaper here in Iceland, and for 100,000 kroners, which is roughly about, I would say, 800 pounds. But he was trying to flip this information on several locations. So leak is not really the correct word. He's been trying to generated this picture of him that he's a leaker and a liberator of information, but he was just trying to peddling it for money.
Could I ask you a question there, which is one of the things which has been responsible for creating this worldwide picture of him as a hacker, an article in
by the Rolling Stones. Yeah. I mean, he was just a good con artist, and he was able to con the journalist, basically. He did the same with the BBC. There was a famous radio interview with the BBC where he's talking about his hacking skills, how he broke into a military complex and accessed the security camera feeds. He then declared someone dead, and then he declared someone bankrupt. Well, you know, first of all, here in Iceland, you cannot declare someone bankrupt or dead just by, you know, hacking. There are several layers that you have to go through to be able to process this. So it's just basically at that time, just not going to happen. It's just not possibly to do so through a hacking, even though you're best hacker in the world. You would never be able to do this. The reason why he actually said this was also he used this against his victims while he was actually abusing them, that he could actually declare them bankrupt, he could declare them dead, he could do this to their family, and so on. So this is more of intimidation tactic by him by keeping the name Siggi the Hacker. But through all my research of all the chat logs that I have between him and other individuals and also the FBI, I can see no evidence to show that he was actually a hacker. He never hacked any institution. He never got information by hacking. So, but he was a thief, and he was able to get the milestone documents, for example, just with a USB key. That's it. So,
So this idea that he put forward in the Rolling Stone article, that he was somehow this child prodigy who had been given access to milestone and managed to steal the data while he was in there, was all a nice big story, is it?
Yeah, he just put a USB key into a computer and took a lot of documents. That's it. I mean, it's no hacking skills at all. You just have to basically copy paste. And I mean, but the image he held up, I think, was used for intimidation, because at that time, I would say many people didn't really know the computer world. We were just hitting the face of social media and all these, basically everything was happening at the time regarding computer technology. So he used this, and I have seen the chat logs where he's actually using this against his victims, and many victims have also spoken on the record and off the record about how he was using this against them. So it's sorry to say, the Rolling Stone article is one of his first and one of his best cons that he ever made, that the journalist really didn't double check the information that he was given.
That's really interesting, because like the Rolling Stone article, there are a number of articles which have been quite big hatchet jobs against Julian. And one of the things I did when I was looking at the Rolling Stone article and similar articles was there was an accusation that, there was this email that had been provided which showed that Julian and WikiLeaks didn't give the money they were supposed to give to Bradley Manning's support network. And if you actually look at the email, I went and found the source. I was surprised to find that actually they are thanking WikiLeaks that despite being cut off from PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, they were putting $15,000 into the support network. And of course, both Julian and Chelsea have paid with their lives in order to protect each other. So these kinds of smears are very common in the Assange campaign. And it's interesting to see the PR world and the PR created by Mr. Thordarson taking in journalists at mainstream publications, but of course we're not surprised. You were telling us a little bit more about Mr. Thordarson. You said you stopped where you were, or rather we went on a little diversion when you were telling us about his name as a hacker. But actually he's not a hacker, but so please do continue.
Yeah, regarding though the case regarding the Chelsea Manning Foundation, a defense network, sorry, I have not seen any evidence that this was a problem, but I haven't seen any evidence that it was a problem. But many people have actually come on a record and spoken about that this was a problem of getting money to the Chelsea Manning defense network. I mean, but I have not been able to verify any of these information. This is all now just basically based on the testimony of people that I've spoken to. But back to Siggi then, he is a complicated character, and after he was sentenced in Iceland, for example, he of these 3 sentences, which was the first one was 8 months, the second one was that was for abusing a minor, the second one was for fraud, and that was 2 years, and then he got the third one, which was 3 years for abusing 9 minors. He actually just was in jail for 9 months of these 3 years that he was sentenced for abusing 9 minors. 11 actually pressed charges, but 9 only made it to court. And one of these victims of his actually committed suicide later after that, after the court session and he had the information he will not go in with his case into court. But the character Siggi is, I mean, I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist, but it's a fascinating case as a writer to write about. And you can see the complexity of this character on so many levels, and how two-faced he can be in his life. On one side, he's using this childish look, young boy, and somehow using this Jedi power, as I call it, on people that for some reason they are willing to take part of the scam that he is trying to run. It doesn't work, for example, on me. I don't think it works on specifically intelligent people, but I think what his best thing is that he's really good at conning people and tell them exactly what they want to hear. And that's basically a beautiful art form of the con artists, and how they are able to convince their victims to do things. And he's also, one thing I have never been able to find out is how he is able to connect to powerful people and rich people. And I haven't been able to find any reason why these people would actually want to be associated with him, because after he was sentenced for this child abuse or minor abuse in court. So it's Siggi for a writer is it's a fascinating character, but in real life he's not really a good member of society, I would say.
It's interesting to hear you say that, and yet clearly the FBI were willing to use his testimony, and it is quite interesting. I again do a little sidestep to see that the FBI in 2011, when they came to Iceland saying there was going to be a denial of service attack, they were, in the words of the former Interior Minister, Mr. Ögmundur Jónasson, they pretended as though there was an impending attack, yet they were well aware of the background they were doing nothing to stop it happening. In fact, they were glad for it to happen so that they could pretend they were offering assistance, and therefore then use that opportunity to do other things. And yet today, in 2019, when the FBI came again to interview Mr. Thordarson, the Icelandic government, which previously had refused to collaborate with the FBI, was now in some kind of offering some kind of support to the FBI. How many times have the FBI interviewed Mr. Thordarson? I understand there have been multiple occasions.
Yeah, and several countries actually. The first time was, of course, here in Iceland. He was actually interviewed by the FBI just, few days after he first contacted the U.S. Embassy here in Iceland in August of 2011. The FBI agents, of course, arrived here on the note that they were actually trying to protect Iceland against a cyber attack. And we didn't have any cyber defense infrastructure here in Iceland at the time. So of course, willingly, we accepted the assistance of the FBI in this case, but there's no evidence of this so-called pending cyber attack. There's none. And there was a research done inside the Ministry of Interior. The Icelandic National Police sent 2 officers to New York to investigate this with the FBI, and there was basically nothing. The only thing you can actually see is regarding cyber attacks is when Siggi actually was speaking to Sabu, which at the time was actually an FBI informant. So, I mean, if there was a pending cyber attack that would then possibly be coming from Sabu, then basically FBI knew everything about it and they could actually control him because he was actually he was working for the FBI at the time. So, but it's the first time we saw that the FBI came here in Iceland, then Mr. Ömundur Jónasson actually then kicked them out because he figured out that there was no impending cyber attack. They were just doing this to research to investigate WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So he decided by law, of course, and everything legally, because they came here on false pretense. So of course they were kicked out by the Icelandic authorities. After they were kicked out, Siggi then met with the FBI in Denmark, and they had several discussions there. And then he was actually flown out to Washington D.C. And spoke, and the FBI spoke to him again there. Then few years passed, and we're then back in 2019. There you have that the FBI came here in Iceland. The Icelandic government gave the authority to come here and interview Mr. Thordarson. The interview was done in the local police station here in the capital in Reykjavik. But it should have been a cooperation agreement between the Icelandic National Police and the FBI. So the Icelandic police would actually assist on this. But according to Mr. Thordarson, he was only asked 5 questions by the Icelandic authorities. That was basically his name, social security number, address, phone number, and email. Just basic, confirmation information about himself. And then they stepped into another room, and there you had the members of the FBI and the district attorney of Southern New York. And that's the first time the plea deal, the immunity deal is made. And according to Mr. Thordarson, that was his idea to get that agreement with the FBI. But after that meeting in Reykjavik, they had another meeting in Washington in 2019, and then they actually went back in 2020, early 2020, to sign the agreement. But he had 2 different lawyers. The reason why is because he actually was forging the signature of his first lawyer, which he went with to the US. And there's now a pending police investigation on that forgery against him. So he was even conning his own lawyer at the time. But then, of course, when he signed the immunity agreement in the US, the case then was, the US actually updated their indictment, where they concluded and put in Siggi's testimony. And there you can see the obvious reason why they updated it was because they wanted to change Julian Assange from a journalist into a hacker. So the New York Times problem would just, disappear with Siggi's testimony.
Right, and this is the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge.
Yes, yes.
Can I just, on that note, in terms of the Icelandic police just asking 5 questions, just ask you, was this interview which he actually had with the FBI, were the Icelandic police present, and is there any likelihood of records on their side in terms of what was said at the interview?
No. I mean, the Icelandic police did their own interview, were these 5 questions, and that's it.
So they weren't present when
they weren't present in the room, according to Mr. Thordarson.
Right. And it does seem strange that we, at least here in Britain, we seem to think that these Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland and Finland, all have higher standards of human rights than we come to expect within within Britain, where, of course, we have a journalist sitting in Belmarsh maximum security prison. But it is quite interesting to see the change in that all these countries are now willing to cooperate with the US. Is that part of a broader change in Iceland where the US influence is growing?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I think this interview was just a formality. I mean, they asked for it and they got it. I don't think the government is really keen on working with the Americans in this case, because most Icelanders support what WikiLeaks have done. And we had just now the newest case from a WikiLeaks leak was the fish rod files about the scandal in Namibia, where one of the largest fishing company here in Iceland were bribing officials in Namibia to get fishing quotas. And you know, we love information leak here in Iceland. It has changed politics here in Iceland. We got the Panama Papers, and at that time, the prime minister had to resign and the government exploded. After the financial collapse, there was a lot of leaks coming out of the financial system on how these people were operating. And you could see that, you know, Iceland, they love information leaks. And I don't think that any politician here in Iceland is actually trying to willingly help the United States government to squash any leaks. I have seen no evidence of that, and I just, if I check the political reality here in Iceland, nobody's doing that. We actually have a prime minister now who's actually trying to get better laws to protect the whistleblowers. So I don't think that we could be in a position or put in the same position as other Nordic countries, which are maybe violating a little bit human rights more than we do, because we haven't. We might have been puppets in it, but we might not. We were never taking any action in it. And you can see this by how the Mr. Ögmundur Jónasson, how he was actually dealing with the FBI, how he actually just kicked them out. And that was not done by a political reason. It was done by a legal reason. It was not some political movement by a ultra left party. This was done based on law that we have here in Iceland, and FBI broke these laws. So, and also what you can see here is that there is no, and there have never been investigation of any of these alleged crimes that are in the indictment that happened in Iceland. And many legal experts point out, why is it a problem for the US that Mr. Assange was trying to commit crimes in Iceland? How did that affect anything, in this case? And the funny thing is that we are not trying even to get this case through. We don't have any police investigations. We are not, the prosecutors here in Iceland, not trying to get the case going. There is no crime that happened here in Iceland. So, and even in the case of where you see in the indictment where, according to documents, that Mr. Thordarson was asked by Mr. Assange to hack Mr. Snorrason, a former member of WikiLeaks. Well, here's the problem. Siggi didn't have any hacking skills, so he didn't actually was able to do that. He actually asked Assange for advice how to do it, and eventually he didn't do it even. So the US has in the indictment a possible computer crime that happened from one Icelandic citizen to another Icelandic citizen in Iceland, which were never investigated by the Icelandic authorities. So on a legal standpoint, this does not make sense, because the only evidence we have here is Siggi testimony and the chat log between Julian and Mr. Thordarson. So, but there was no crime. Was there intention? I have no idea. And that's something that the court of law has to make a decision, not any lawyer.
Indeed. And it's quite interesting on two fronts. One is the way in which, in the case of El-Zari and Agiza, Sweden rendited to Egyptian asylum seekers to Egypt, where they were tortured, and the handling party who were involved in the transport were the Americans, and this was in relation to the America's war on terror. And then Denmark, the revelations recently, earlier this year, about Denmark's cooperation with the American authorities to spy on EU member state senior people. So it's very interesting to hear that that's not the case in Iceland, and quite reassuring actually, which is the final bastion, so to speak, within the Nordics in some way. The other question I wanted to ask you was, could you tell us a little bit, maybe summarize for people who are not so close to the case, what it is the allegations are that relate to Mr. Assange, and what it is that the US is saying about it. I know you alluded to it in talking about the indictment, but if you could just, for ease of reference.
Yeah. There are a few cases in the indictment which actually are when teenager, which is basically Mr. Thordarson, and NATO country 1 is mentioned, and that's basically Iceland. The first one and most important one is that, according to the indictment, Mr. Assange asked Mr. Thordarson to hack the Parliament of Iceland to try to get phone recordings from the members of Parliament in Iceland. But we have a huge problem regarding this with this part in the indictment, because according to Mr. Thordarson, and in my article I wrote about it, is that there was no hacking of the Icelandic Parliament done by Siggi, and Mr. Assange never asked Mr. Thordarson to hack the Icelandic Parliament. According to him, he was only handed a USB stick, and he was not sure how big it was. He actually, in my interview, he got the wrong numbers of the size of the USB key. He was talking about 34 to 64 gigabytes, which doesn't exist in the computer world. So you can see that his computer skills are not even that great. He knows how gigabytes and megabytes actually work. But you can see that there was no investigation here in Iceland of this. And the small investigation was done inside the parliament. The few people who were actually spoken to about this mysterious laptop inside the parliament, there was nothing. It was a big nothing. And you can see through this that this is completely wrong. That there were no information, and also, what information would they be getting out of members of Icelandic Parliament? I have no idea what they would want. And if they had it, why didn't they publish it? If they had it, because they got it from a source, according to Mr. Thordarson, and there's nothing illegal of taking then these phone conversations and then put them out, because they got them from a source. They did not steal them themselves, and that's just basic journalism. And that means, and that also points out that they eventually did not have them. But we have no evidence that show that. So this is difficult to make. This indictment doesn't make sense in many areas. The second one is actually also that in the indictment it points out that Mr. Assange got an access from Mr. Thordarson to track police vehicles in Iceland. According to Sigurdur, he gave him this access. So Assange did not ask for this access, and there's no evidence that points out that he actually used it. And according to my research, I have found no evidence that there was any investigation of misuse of this database. And again, we have then a potential crime that happened again in Iceland, not in the US. So the Icelandic authorities should be now pursuing this case and putting it for prosecution, but we are not. And then there are several other details, for example, with the bank documents that Siggi was supposedly asked by Mr. Assange, Mr. Thordarson was asked by Mr. Assange to hack, to get stolen bank documents. Well, everybody had those bank documents. This was the so-called Landsbanki file, which was the loan book of Landsbankin. And all journalists in Iceland had it before even Mr. Thordarson had it. It was online. But the problem was that nobody could actually decrypt it because it was encrypted. So the only thing that, according to Mr. Thordarson, he asked David House to try to decrypt this Landsbanki loan book through some MIT computers, according to Mr. Thordarson. But they were unsuccessful to do so. So there is a lot of cases inside any, and then there's another bank documents that basically are not bank documents, that are the milestone documents. And that has nothing to do with Mr. Assange, because Siggi was doing that before he even know of and heard of Mr. Assange. So we have no idea from a legal standpoint why these things are in the US indictment, other than to make him up some hacker. And there's no other reason. But all the indictments doesn't make sense. If you go through each and every one of them, you can see that there's not a lot of evidence to back them up. And even in the appeal case now, which the US has been running against to try to get him indicted, they have been doubling down on Mr. Thordarson's testimony about how Mr. Assange is basically a hacker and not a journalist. So it's getting really embarrassing to see members of the court system, the US attorneys, to use this testimony without actually double checking if this is correct. And also that these things have nothing to do with the US. All these supposedly crimes that happened in Iceland. And it's really funny that you don't see any investigations or any court filing or any prosecution regarding this issue from Icelandic authorities. So I don't understand from a legal standpoint why they're even in the indictment.
That's really fascinating, because one of the things that has been repeatedly said through, I was observing the hearings in London, is that the expert witnesses and those providing testimony and the prosecutors all owe a duty to the court to be full and complete. And presumably now, with the release of this information by yourself, and indeed information, publicly available information about Mr. Thordarson's convictions, those are things that the US prosecutor, Mr. Kromberg, as well as the British CPS prosecutor, Mr. Lewis, should have made very clear to the judge in terms of the reliability of Mr. Thordarson's evidence. And I haven't seen in the documentation that I've seen, the US making any admissions about Mr. Thordarson's criminal record, the unreliability of his statement. So it's very interesting to hear you say this. To move a little bit beyond what Mr. Thordarson's opened up to saying, could you tell us what it is that prompted you to ask him these questions at this point in time? Why is it that you asked Mr. Thordarson any questions at all? Why suddenly?
Yeah, well, I got information that he was actually starting conning again in Iceland. So basically, copy pasting his things that he has actually been convicted of here in Iceland back in 2014. So I investigated that, and I found out that he was doing serious financial fraud. We're talking about tens of thousands of US dollars that he was able to con out of companies. And he was also using his name as a so-called funeral director, as we call them here in Iceland. That's basically a name which is put on a company, a chairman of the board of a company which is going bankrupt. So if there are any fees that the company owns to the government, it falls on his head, these fees. So he's used to doing this in the past. And I thought it was, I already did an article about him back in 2018 when I was at DV, and I think I was maybe 3 months in the job at the time. And that was my first interaction with him. But I checked this up and I said, okay, listen, there is some financial fraud going on here. And I found all the evidence. And I had an interview with him. And when I had him there, the FBI case came up. And we spoke for almost over 9 hours regarding this case, regarding the fraud, and also the FBI case and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and everything. So it's just moved on as an investigative piece, that there was so much there that was able to be investigated and should be investigated, because you had a pathological liar, a borderline sociopath, according to court documents, that was the star witness of the FBI. And, from a legal standpoint, to be using such a character as such a huge witness in this huge indictment, it didn't make any legal sense to me. So that's why I started asking questions.
Could you tell us a little bit about this funeral director? I'm not sure I understood you correctly.
Well, so if a company is almost going bankrupt, so it basically doesn't have any money, it's been borrowing too much, and it owes a lot of money, both to private companies and also to the government regarding taxes and other fees. So what many owners of these companies do is that they hire a so-called funeral director. And what they do is they wash their name completely out from the company, so they're not connected to it anymore, and they bring in a funeral director to take over and take the hit when everything collapses. So when the media finally gets all the information about the company, they can see who's the owner is, and the member of the, not the owner, sorry, but the chairman of the board and CEO and everything, and that's where Siggy comes in. He is the funeral director that many of these guys hired to take the companies down with them. Because you can actually be investigated for fraud if there's anything behind the scenes going on, or if you're actually doing some fraud. And in many cases there were in these companies that he was a funeral director for. So, and there's also back taxes and other fees that the government will then get from the individual who is registered as the chairman of the board, because he is legally obligated to then pay these taxes and fees back to the government personally. So that's why he is, and he's been doing this for many years as a funeral director.
He does seem to have a really strange background. One of the things is, which we have seen in the most recent days in relation to Mr. Assange's case, is the information that the US is giving additional assurances over and above what was provided previously. And of course, Mr. Assange's lawyers have challenged these in the sense that the US, given that it served its final indictment on the first day of the proceedings in September, and of course, Mr. Assange was again denied due process in terms of responding to those allegations. It does seem strange that they weren't able to afford these assurances at the time. And one of the reasons why these assurances have been poo-pooed is because one of the get out clauses they have in it is that should further information come to light, they will be able to move Assange into special administrative measures where he is essentially entombed for life, or they might be able to move him to the ADX in Florence, which is one of the worst penitentiaries in the US. So are the most recent interviews of Mr. Thordarson intended in some way to provide information for them to be able to use this get out clause? Is that why their assurances have been so delayed? Because they're saying, okay, we'll give the assurance, but now we have even more information which was not disclosed before that we can then use were Mr. Assange to be extradited to renege on all our promises, because these diplomatic assurances mean nothing, as we've seen in the case of Abu Hamza.
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea what's going inside the DOJ in the US, what the plan is. But I know, only thing I know is that when they updated the indictment, they used Siggy's testimony, which was, yeah, as we have gone through, not really good. But I have no idea what the plan of the DOJ is in this case. It will only be speculations on my point. But you can see it though thoroughly that this is not something that they want to go all the way through the court system and want the sentence. They basically want to spin this out. They want to make sure that this takes as much time as possible. And you know, you have all the points where you can see this, and you can point this out in many occasions where the US just want to drag it through the system all over again, so they can just keep Mr. Assange in jail now for as long as they can. But other ones would just be speculation on my point. And as I said, I'm not a legal expert, and I have no idea what's going on in the minds of these lawyers inside the DOJ.
And of course, you know, the US, there is evidence that is yet to be disclosed to the wonderful journalist Stefania Marisi in relation to conversations between the British, the Swedish, and the Americans in relation to the extradition, the European arrest warrant that was issued, and the subsequent processes in relation to Sweden. So they tried the easy way to rendict Julian to a tier 1 country and then potentially onward to US, and now the plan B, which is the Stratfor plan, which is to keep Julian in prison, make him eat cat food, as they say, and move him from country to country and destroy him of his finances and his family. So that's now in play. I wasn't sure whether this was a matter of translation or whether it was just that I had not understood it correctly. So I'm curious, is Mr. Thordarson still cooperating with the FBI? So is there potentially new information that Mr. Thordarson is currently handing over to the FBI? Because presumably one of the things he says in this interview with you is that he signed this immunity agreement, which says that even if he had lied on anything which was minor, the immunity agreement is revoked. So presumably there is something that that puts him in a position to for the US to continue to say, this is our source and this is the teenager whose name we won't disclose.
Well, they have actually contacted Mr. Thordarson after the article has been published. Although Mr. Thordarson was not willing to give out what that conversation was about, but they are, I think, in a little bit trouble with now his testimony, and I think that, I mean, this will have more significant impact in the court itself than in the media, because this is a legal definition, this is a legal case, and these are fine legal, actions that have been done here. But I don't know if the FBI will withdraw Mr. Thordarson as a witness, because he actually might be in jail in Iceland at the time when he will have to testify, if this case goes all the way to the US and Mr. Assange is extradited, because he's facing investigations here in Iceland now for forgery and fraud. So I don't know how the FBI is going to actually handle this now, their witness, but they're going to have some trouble with it. And Mr. Thordarson has gone on the record now with several individuals, and he's always has the same story to tell. So we don't know what the future will hold, basically.
Right. And in terms of the team that worked with you on this investigation, I guess often the lead journalist gets given a lot of credit. Is there anybody else you would like to mention who has been involved in this, or is it best to keep their names off the record so that they can continue to work on important things like this?
Yeah, I was helped a lot in this case, and I mean, Gunnar Hrafn, which is also written for this story, he actually helped me a lot regarding the English version of the article. That's where he comes in and did a beautiful job to translate this really long, lengthy article I did, because the original Icelandic one is much bigger and complete than the English one, because it goes into such details regarding what was happening here in Iceland at the time, and regarding politics, regarding all these fraud cases, regarding his former convictions and all of that. But Gunnar helped me extremely well in getting this summarized for the English version to get published out there. And I got several people who helped me out. My former editor, which hired me in the beginning as a journalist, he helped me really well in regarding getting this story correctly. And a great friend of mine, Mr. Valur Grettisson, he is a former journalist, a crime journalist in Iceland, and an author. So he helped me out tremendously, and of course the editors and all the members of the staff in Stundin. So, I mean, yes, I was registered for this story by myself, but there's been a huge effort of people behind me that actually got this done, because I needed a lot of advice while I was doing this, and I got advice from really good people and journalists with much more experience than I have, since I've only been in this for almost 4 years now. So there were many people that helped me out.
Well, it's like an Oscars thank you, isn't it? But I am sure there are a number of people whom I guess we as readers feel very grateful to all of you for. I'd like to ask you a slightly tangential question, which is, clearly you see yourself as a journalist, having moved from a completely different field to journalism and now doing this at a newspaper. In your opinion, is what WikiLeaks does and what Kristen now is editor-in-chief of and what Julian was previously doing, do you see that as journalism? And if you do, or if you don't, why?
Of course. I mean, this is basic journalism, one-on-one. We have so many precedents in this case. I mean, we had the Pentagon Papers and a lot of leaks before. The thing is that this is just a new form of journalism. This was the new form of the 21st century, where we have all this data, which are being held or kept from us as citizens of these countries. And I mean, most of these information coming from democracies like the United States or Germany or the UK. Of course, this is journalism. This is, if you try to say that this is something else, this is espionage or whatever, no. I mean, this is just information that got out. Many people got really embarrassed regarding this information. There were war crimes that this actually showed. So, I mean, you cannot try to convince me that there's some other definition than journalism that this falls under. This is utter complete nonsense if you want to do something else. And what I've gone through is that in this case is that many people want to put Mr. Assange's personality inside this case. Well, it has nothing to do with Mr. Assange. This has everything to do with journalism. You can, dislike Assange, you can like Assange. It doesn't matter. He can be an idiot. He could be the next Jesus. It doesn't matter, really, because every journalist has done something like this. A real investigative journalist has done something like this on just different scales. And if you just go to the core of the case, what is it? Well, they published secret files, classified information. That's it. That's the core of this case. And I mean, it's not a big thing here, but we in Iceland, we disclose classified things all the time. Small issues, of course, that don't hit the international news cycle, but it actually helps out. I mean, and where was this again? And when the Panama Papers came out, was that a crime against all these rich people who were actually scamming the governments from paying taxes? No. So because the victim in this case is the United States government and U.S. politicians in high places, I don't know how to describe it better than to say, yes, of course, it's journalism, and you can actually, how can I say that? It baffles me to see why people want to think of this as something else. And I think what people are actually doing is that they're just putting dust in the water in this conversation and try to bring up Julian Assange personality in it, like he's working for the Russians or he's doing this. This was just for Trump and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. Information is information. And that's the whole case here.
Thank you. That was very clear. I'd like to end by just saying that I'd be interested to know from you as an investigative journalist, what you think, when you look at the case happening in London, what is your perception of the British legal system sitting on the outside? Because clearly the judge in the extradition case has, on the basis of the evidence provided by Mr. Thordarson, via the FBI has upheld all the charges, so to speak, related to journalism. The only barriers which have been activated relate to Mr. Assange's mental health and US prison conditions. And so it militates against the kinds of arguments you're making. So I'd be curious to see, as somebody sitting outside Britain, what your views are of the British legal system. And obviously no contempt of court involved, but just in your opinion, what do you think?
Just in my opinion, I think the UK court system should not play in this game. I mean, it's a farce. That's it. And everybody who actually has some legal experience can see that this has nothing to do with justice. And that's what we base our court system on. And that's, you know, if you go in the core of law and order and the justice system, how it should work, it's done to get justice. And in no case can I see that there will be any justice done by convicting a journalist for putting out information that was embarrassing for people, especially politicians, that showed war crimes, that showed corruption, that showed environmental pollution cases. I don't see why we would take that journalist and try to convict him in the case of that would be justice. Because what I think we're losing the focus on here is that did we get any justice for all these crimes that were in the leaks that WikiLeaks put out, and which all the major newspapers put in, New York Times, Washington Post, the Spiegel, or the Guardian? I mean, did we get justice? Did these citizens of Iraq and Afghanistan, did they get justice? No. And I think we're just, I think we're losing the sight. And I was talking to my dear friend Bjartmar Alexandersson about this, is that maybe we're just numb to it, that we could get justice for these people who were basically brutally murdered, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's like, because this, oh yeah, 40 citizens died in Afghanistan today. Well, that's old news. There's nothing special about it anymore. But the drama behind this case and everything, that's something which is exciting. You know what I mean? So the word justice should not even be used in this case against Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks in this, because I cannot see how he did any harm by putting out this information. The only harm that was done was by the criminals themselves who were in these documents.
On that note, I'm really grateful for the time you've given us, and thank you so much for your work, and all power to you in future investigations. And thank you.
Thank you.